Welcome to the first of two World Sociology screencasts on gender inequalities. This is a really important topic area because if you pick any significant measure of development, it's almost guaranteed that the experience of women will be notably worse than their male counterparts. And that is why the United Nations has now incorporated gender equality as a measure of development in its important annual human development reports. So in these reports there's now something called the Gender Inequality Index, which measures gender inequality by looking at three main areas. It looks at inequality within work or the labour market. It looks at empowerment of women, which it measures by looking at the representation of women within Parliament and the amount of women who are attaining education at secondary level or higher. And also it looks at health by focusing on reproductive health, looking at things like the maternal mortality rate and the adolescent fertility rate. Also remember that the promotion of gender equality and female empowerment is Millennium Development Goal number 3. Okay, this is an overview of how this topic is structured, and this structure follows the worksheet that you've got. So in this screencast we're going to focus on the first bit of your worksheet, which is types of gender inequality, and then in the second screencast we'll look at explanations of gender inequalities, and we'll also look at some of the policies that have been used to address gender inequalities. So as usual, make sure that you make plenty of notes as we go through these areas. And in this screencast I'm going to be looking at types of gender inequality by drawing upon the work of Amartya Sen, who focuses on 7 different types of gender inequality. So firstly, across the developing world, women often lack access to really basic institutions, particularly things like basic education, which could enable them to reach their full potential. And secondly, we've got what Sen calls special opportunities, which is the idea that beyond this very basic provision, women encounter even greater barriers. So in many developing countries, they're particularly restricted in the context of higher education and training. Thirdly, Sen talks about professional inequalities, and by this he's referring to the inequalities that tend to exist in the labour market. So for example, women are often underrepresented within many of the traditional high status, high paid professions. Fourthly, in many societies the ownership of property can be extremely unequal, and this means that even basic assets such as home and land may be very unfairly shared, and this can restrict women's social influence and also their ability to engage in business and commerce. And this is one of the reasons why microcredit initiatives have often been targeted at women. Fifthly, we've got inequalities at the level of the household, at the level of the family. So within the family, power and decision making might favour men, and it's usually the case that women do the bulk of the domestic labour, the bulk of the childcare, the bulk of the emotional work. The sixth type of inequality relates to mortality, and it's the case that in most countries women generally outlive men. However, there are areas of the world which have very patriarchal cultures where this generalisation does not hold. So for example, in both India and Pakistan, it's men who generally outlive women. And then the final type of inequality that Sen identifies is natality. And this is the idea that gender inequality can manifest itself in the form of the parents wanting their newborn baby to be a boy rather than a girl, given the patriarchal culture of some countries. More than 100 million women are missing, Professor Sen wrote in 1990. And Sen noted that this was because in normal circumstances women tend to live longer than men, yet in places where girls have a deeply unequal status, they vanish. So for example, China has 107 males for every 100 females in its overall population, and an even greater disproportion if we just focused on newborns. And in the case of India, India has 108 males for every 100 females in the population. And in Pakistan, there are 111 males for every 100 females in its overall population. So in their recent book about gender inequalities, Half the Sky, Christos and Woodan argue that every year at least another 2 million girls worldwide disappear because of gender discrimination. To quote directly from the book, it appears that more girls have been killed in the last 50 years, precisely because they were girls, than men were killed in all of the battles of the 20th century. More girls are killed in this routine genocide in any one decade than people were slaughtered in all of the genocides of the 20th century. So how can we explain the disappearance of 2 million girls worldwide? Well, part of the explanation in India is because mothers are less likely to take their daughters to be vaccinated than their sons. And that alone is estimated to account for around about 1/5 of Indians' missing females. And all told, girls in India from 1 to 5 years of age are a staggering 50% more likely to die than boys of the same age. And this is a picture of a 13-year-old Ethiopian girl in an emergency feeding station in southern Ethiopia. And what was interesting about this case study is that all of her brothers were relatively well fed, and virtually all of the children at this feeding centre were girls. And as the caption says, this reflects the way in which parents in patriarchal societies typically give priority to boys when food is scarce. Modernisation and technology can also aggravate gender discrimination. So since the 1990s, the spread of ultrasound machines has allowed women to find out the sex of their fetuses and then get abortions if they're female. And this became such a big problem in China and India that the government in these countries now prohibits doctors from telling a pregnant woman the sex of her fetus. However, research shows that when parents are banned from selectively aborting female fetuses, more of their daughters die as infants. And this map of the world shows the countries where these problems are the worst. So it's these countries that are coloured in this kind of darker blue colour. So this South Asian region is a particular problem. So we've completed the first screencast on this topic, where we've identified 7 types of gender inequality, and what we'll look at in the second screencast is we'll look at explanations of these gender inequalities, and then we'll look at some of the policies that can be implemented to alleviate and reduce some of these gender inequalities.